Hello and welcome to Task 1 in Unit 503. My name is Brent Warren. I'm the Training Director and one of the tutors at CMBD. Now, if you've just finished or watched the previous video on preparation, you might recall that we finished there on page 3 of the assignment brief. So, looking at page 4, where we're going to start writing about Task 1, a couple of things that we need to just pick up on. The very first thing it says there is write a good practice guide entitled Approaches to Managing and Leading Teams. The good practice guide will be used by other managers in the organisation and must do a number of things. So the best thing to do is to imagine that you're writing this report for your colleagues in your own organisation, if that's the approach you're taking. The next thing that we need to note is that we're required to have subheadings. Now, when we look at Task 1, we've got 3 what we call ACs, 1.1, 1.2 and 1.3. So it makes a certain amount of sense to say, well, okay, we need at least 3 subheadings. It also tells you that you can paste in appropriate charts or diagrams if they'll help support your answer. You're not allowed appendices, of course. Things like that go in the evidence booklet. But pasting in a decent chart or diagram that you've found is one of the best ways to save word count on the planet. If, for example, you wanted to refer to Belbin team role theory, there's plenty of suitable diagrams both on Management Direct and on the internet that can be cut and pasted in to save you writing about it. Diagrams don't show up in your word count. Do, of course, remember that if you get something off the internet, you maybe from the Management Direct website or in this example from Belbin's website, make sure you acknowledge who the original work was by in a reference, and you also reference the site that you grabbed the screen image from. There's a clear example of how to do this in the video tutorial on referencing. The final points to note at this stage is that we are required to use some models and theories. It'd actually be pretty difficult to do 1.1 without that because you're asking you to evaluate 2 theoretical models. And finally, they're saying you must refer to the indicative content for each of the assessment criteria outlined in the unit specification. And you will see for 1.1 that there's a list of potential models that you could use to talk about. Now, so far it might appear to be a little bit overwhelming with all the different sources of information and all the instructions and all the guidance. But trust me, once you start writing and once you start putting it together, you soon get the hang of it. So let's look at AC 1.1 in detail. We've already been told what our good practice guide for our colleagues is going to be called. It's going to be called Approaches to Managing and Leading Teams. So we need a suitable subheading for AC 1.1. Now, this is only a personal piece of advice, but I like to suggest that subheadings should include the command verb. So for 1.1, it may be, the evaluation of 2 theoretical models for managing and leading teams. I would also put brackets AC 1.1 close brackets at the end of the subheading because that clearly lets the assessor know which bit of the answer we're tackling at the moment. A quick glance at the word count chart tells us that we've got 1,500 words in total for Task 1. We've got 3 ACs within that, and in this first one, 1.1, we're required to evaluate 2 theoretical models. So we've got 250 words for each, which is not a lot. This is definitely one of those ACs where maybe we're going to need to go a little bit over and take full advantage of our plus 10%. Going more than that is not a deal breaker. The assignment word count is for the overall assignment, so sometimes we can do a little bit of robbing Peter to pay Paul. Our next port of call should be the syllabus, the unit specification as it's referred to in the assignment brief. And if we look at the indicative content for 1.1, it suggests a number of models that we might want to choose our 2 from. This is not an exhaustive list. I mean, for example, I quite like Belbin team role theory in this part, and it's not mentioned. However, having done your learning journey, having thought about your examples, pick the 2 that you're happiest with and that you think you can write comfortably about. Now, given that our subheading was about evaluating theoretical models, we've got some sub-subheadings which are simply the name of the model that you've chosen to use. Finally, we need to consider the command verb evaluate. Now, when I look at the command verb definitions, this one's a right mouthful, and I quote, "Consider the strengths and weaknesses, arguments for and against, and/or similarities and differences. The writer should then judge the evidence from the different perspectives and make a valid conclusion or reasoned judgment. Apply current research or theories to support the evaluation where applicable." So how would you apply this to 1.1? Well, the start point is consider the strengths and weaknesses. Maybe you've picked Belbin as a model and you need to talk briefly about the pros and cons of that particular model. You're then asked to write about perspectives. I mean, a good example with Belbin might be your perspective as a manager in understanding how to manage allowable weaknesses. You might write about the perspective of the staff. If you understand what their strengths are and weaknesses are, maybe you can make sure they're doing things and contributing in a way that's motivating. And finally, you need to draw some sort of conclusion, make some sort of judgment, if you like, recommending it to your colleagues within the Good Practice Guide, but bear in mind these issues. So let's move on to 2.2. We've got the same word count, we've got 500 words to play with, and we are being asked to discuss practical approaches for effective team management and leadership. We're not told how many approaches, but given that we were asked to provide 2 theoretical models in 1.1, it makes a certain amount of sense to go for 2, possibly 3 if you've got the word count approaches. Going to the syllabus, we've got a number of approaches suggested. We've got things like fairness and parity, setting clear aims and objectives, empowerment, etc. Simply pick 2 of those as your sub-headings and write about how you could use them effectively in your report to your colleagues. There's no particular references or sources mentioned in this particular AC, but there's quite a lot of stuff on Management Direct. Maybe you can find a case study on, not having clear objectives, and try and get a couple in for each approach. Okay, the last thing we need to do before we start penning our answer to 1.2 is to consider the command verb discuss. Now, if I have a look at the definitions, discuss is to give a detailed account, including a range of views or opinions, which include contrasting perspectives. Now, you're already familiar with different perspectives, so what we're looking for is perhaps the opinion of the managers, maybe the opinion of the staff, maybe the opinion of more senior management, or indeed some model or theorist. And at the end of our answer to 1.2, we need to consider all these different opinions and make a judgment and a recommendation to our imaginary or real colleagues. Moving on to the final AC in Task 1, we have got analyse 2 strategies for managing team leaders. Now, as previously, first port of call is the indicative content in the syllabus, where we've got a range of strategies suggested and we need to pick 2 of those. It's a very similar approach to 1.2, but what we have got is a different command verb, analyse. So looking at the command verb definitions, we have got break the subject or complex situation into separate parts, examine each part in detail, identify the main issues and show how the main ideas are related to practice and why they are important. Reference to current research or theory may support the analysis. So how would this apply, for example, to the delegation strategy? Well, let's start with that if delegation is done properly and correctly, it's a really good thing. However, done badly, it can be incredibly destructive. You could therefore consider in your analysis some of the main factors that determine whether a delegation strategy would succeed or fail. You could perhaps evidence your analysis with some examples. Maybe you've been delegated to poorly in the past. What effect did that have? On the other hand, you might have seen examples of really good delegation. And finally, in the analysis, having talked about some of the main ideas and issues, you need to talk about how these affect putting, for example, a delegation strategy into practice. Okay, so that concludes our fairly detailed look at task 1. Task 1 is probably the most difficult of the 3 tasks, so in the next video I'll look at 2 and 3 together and hope they will be helpful as well. Thank you for listening.